Welcome back to the Contrarians, everybody. Today we have another Patreon suggested topic. I believe this one is called the creativity and diversity of progressive metal. Now, I have to confess that this is not a subject that I know a lot about. I primarily was introduced to progressive metal by attending Prog Power Festival in Atlanta for several years. Before that, I didn't even really know that progressive metal was a thing. I'm a moderate progressive rock fan and a heavy metal fan, but didn't really know that there was a genre made out of combining those two things. So I'm going to rely on the panel to educate me, and hopefully they're going to educate you in the process. So we're going to kick it off with the OG contrarian, Mr. Martin Popoff. Martin, tell us about the creativity and diversity of progressive metal.
Yes, thanks very much. I'm going to keep things fairly general and fairly short here because I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to be at the Bills game, but I'm still going, and which is coming up tomorrow now. So we moved things around and going to it. My first surprise is I thought this was going to be the diversity of prog rock, but anyways, I can talk about prog metal as well because it's kind of the same conversation, just a little tighter. So the idea of having this show being about the creativity and diversity, as with prog rock, I mean, and we did something like this with the new wave of British heavy metal as well, where I proposed this idea of a hub of a bike wheel, right, and then you have spokes going off in all directions from that hub, and it applies for prog in a huge way, moving to things like pop, alternative, metal itself, jazz, so you get fusion out of it. You could go a new age direction, you can go an ambient direction with Brian Eno, so you can go all over the place from that hub being the big four, whatever you could call it. Yes, Genesis, ELP, Jethro Tull, whatever you want, sort of thing, right? But when it comes to prog metal, it's kind of the same sort of thing. And what happens with it is when you have that hub. So I guess a little history first of all. People might say that prog metal started in very odd, fuzzy baby steps, possibly with the likes of Led Zeppelin, The Who, King Crimson. But I think the first band that really defines it, and I've given this sermon many times, is Rush. Not in 74, but more like in 75. When Neil joins, Fly By Night, Caress of Steel, you get, as the way I call it is like, it's literally, Rush is literally progressive rock with a distortion pedal turned on, right? It's essentially smooshing together progressive rock and heavy metal, and they move forward. And really, there's very few bands that you could say even attempted to do anything or dared to do anything like that. I mean, at this point now, you might bring in the likes of Styx and Kansas. And then as we move forward, we get Queensryche, we get Fate's Warning, we get Dream Theater, and then just like heavy metal proper, we have this chopping everything into subgenres sort of thing. So I guess the last thing I'll say is as we move on into this creativity and diversity, I suppose if I'm thinking sort of two main ways to look at progressive metal. One is the most conservative version that sounds like heavy progressive rock, and uses many of those same tropes like odd time signatures, concept albums, long songs, virtuoso playing, a lot of soloing, hobbits, demons, and wizards kind of thing. But then the other way, and I always bring this up, but I remember I always found this really impressive. Talking to Stephen Wilson years ago from Porcupine Tree, which is another important connective tissue. He said that heavy metal is the new progressive rock, right? And that has not been shown more graphically than today's TikTok metal. As you're scrolling through TikTok and you're seeing all the latest deathcore and post-hardcore bands. I mean, this is it's heavier than we ever said heavy metal could ever get, and B, it's more progressive than we ever thought heavy metal could ever get. So really, the most progressive music we have these days is a super 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 extreme version of heavy metal, which is great credit to heavy metal that's happened. But you take your sort of Lorna Shore umbrella of bands, and you've essentially got super impressive progressive metal. I think one of the things that took us there was how Lamb of God builds on Pantera and Metallica, and then you bring in Degent and Meshuggah in that. And then you wind up at this place we're at now, which is super, super progressive. So I will stop there. That's my sermon.
Okay. Now I don't want to steal anybody's thunder, but I do want to ask, because sticking with the fans of a certain age here, how do you think the original heavy metal bands like Black Sabbath, would you include albums like Sabbath Bloody Sabbath and Sabotage in the progressive metal conversation?
No, that gets brought up all the time. I never really considered that. I know people love trying to squeeze that thing in, or Sabotage. I mean, that's the other thing. The definition of progressive, the goodwill, the smart definition of progressive is just doing things super surprising. So you think of Superzar on Sabotage as being very, very progressive and surprising. So that's the cool thing. I mean, I remember once, I went on Pete's show and I did my favorite progressive rock albums, and all of them were like Peter Gabriel Melt and Kate Bush, The Dreaming, and Eno, Another Green World, and King Crimson Beat. I mean, every single one of them was like a post-punk version of progressive. So progressive, I love that definition more so, where you're going, wow, you are being really brave and interesting, rather than just being, early days Marillion, which is just kind of redoing Genesis kind of thing, right? So, yeah. So I would say no. I would say in most cases, yeah. I mean, it's really down to Rush. It's really down to Rush through the 70s until you get to Queensryche sort of thing.
Okay. And I suspect that we're going to get a few different definitions of what progressive means in the comments. So go ahead and leave us your definition of what progressive means in the comments. We would love to read those. And when I say we, I mean Marco, because I never read the comment section. So Todd, yes. Why don't you tell us about the diversity and creativity of progressive metal?
Well, one of the things that I think is, well, there's a couple of things I want to talk about. One of them is that, so you had the beginnings of progressive metal, and I think it really got going with Dream Theater. One of the things about Dream Theater, if you want to talk about diversity, is that, like, for example, Dream Theater has albums like Train of Thought that are pretty dark and relentless all the way through. And then they've got other albums that get lighter and have more melody. And being somebody who's kind of a melody freak, I get real excited for albums like this, and maybe not as excited for albums like this. But and then you had Porcupine Tree. And one of the things that Porcupine Tree did was they had a lot of songs that sounded like progressive rock or art rock. And then they had metal riffs like thrown in there, like in the arrangement, like it would shift from sounding almost kind of Wish You Were Here, and then there would be metal riffs, and then they'd go back to sounding prog. And then Haken took that a step further by basically doing the same thing, but also adding the fact that they would have the pretty part going, the melodic part, and then they would throw the metal riffs on top of it. So they're happening at the same time. And so to me, that's kind of how the genre changes. And then you have things like Deaf Heaven that are like, they've got elements of prog, they've got elements of metal, they've got elements of shoegaze. And so then things get really interesting. And then you've got bands, a couple of bands have done this, that I think of Anathema, who started out death metal with the growls and everything. And then they morph into full-on art rock. And I think this is a fascinating band. And they also have elements of shoegaze in there. But my favorite progressive metal bands are the ones that some people don't even consider to be progressive metal. Like, I think about Amorphous, which is basically black metal because it's got the growling vocals, but also elements of symphonic metal because they've got choirs and orchestral arrangements, but every so often they throw in like an extra measure of a different time signature, or they drop 2 beats or something like that, or they change keys where you're not expecting them to change keys, or they change keys down instead of up, which is surprising. So they throw you these little curveballs, and I totally think Amorphous is prog metal. Also, Catatonia, which is basically, it could be more classified as melancholic metal. It's just really sad music, but also lots of elements of prog in there, mellotrons and then you've got Elder, which is similar but also has stoner thrown in. So those are the bands that really fascinate me, are the ones that I think are prog metal. Some people think are metal. Some people think are stoner. Some people think are shoegaze. Those are the ones that I like the most. And Martin said that basically, is that's where we're going, is these bands that are heavy, but they've got so many things going on that definitely I think classifies them as progressive metal.
Okay. I want to explore that just a little bit before we move on. So, and we're going to get to regionality, I think, a little bit, and I want to get to our European participant, I think, before I hit a little bit more on regionality. So, do you think bands are starting with, we're going to be a shoegaze band, but add progressive elements, or do you think that they're starting off, we're a progressive band and add shoegaze elements? Let's take Riverside. How would you describe? I know you love Riverside. Riverside's a progressive band, yes?
Yes.
Okay. How would you describe Riverside?
Again, the Riverside's almost impossible to classify.
And does that make them progressive, that they're so hard to classify?
I think so. I mean, it's like I think about their latest album, ID Entity. They've got this song called Big Tech Brother, which has all kinds of more contemporary things happening in it, and then it just shifts into this super cool, really heavy riff, and it's just like, oh, metal. And so yeah, I mean, Riverside, I think, is one of my favorite bands. Well, they have an extraordinarily talented frontman. But to answer your question, I think a lot of bands, especially the youngest ones, are just they're thinking of it as kind of a melting pot, and they're just throwing all their favorite stuff in there. And Philip, you look like you had something to say when they mentioned Riverside?
Yeah, no, when like for me, Riverside, it's in my mind, it's very much like crystallized. That Riverside is basically like, well, they started as this very dark band that is following in the tracks of anything that Steven Wilson did. This very dark, grungy, Pink Floyd-esque, slightly psychedelic thing, a bit like the early mid career of Porcupine Tree. And then they totally morphed into something like Rush and Pink Floyd go to an AOR bar, basically.
Yeah.
That's how I see it.
Okay.
Nice.
All right. Yeah. And one more question, and then I'm going to move on to Christian. But because you guys are educating me, and again, hopefully taking the audience along with me. As an outsider listening to progressive metal, it feels to me like riffs, that's what I'm into metal for, is I'm a riff guy, which is why I was more into the new wave of British heavy metal, your classics like Black Sabbath. I'm more of a riff guy. I feel like progressive metal is much more about atmosphere. It's about soloing and less riff intensive. How do you guys feel about that statement?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I will tell you that prior to listening to progressive metal, I was always a melody guy and not a riff guy at all. And then when I started listening to Porcupine Tree and Riverside and stuff like that, then that became more interesting to me, because I was hearing riffs that were I thought were really innovative. And now I listen to metal, which I never used to. And progressive metal was that bridge for me. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I'd add that today's metal is today's progressive metal is less about soloing or riff, and it's more about rhythm, right? I mean, the drummers are super important in these things, and all those big long spaces that they do. And this is built on that thing that King's X used to do in that famous thing they do live where they're doing all the stop and starting. I can't remember what the name of the song, but kind of all goes from that. There's a lot of that going on with these guys now with those breakdowns, right? Breakdowns kind of started this idea of every song sounds like a string of these really impressive breakdowns now. So I think it's more of a rhythm.
Meshuggah have totally revolutionized the whole idea. I mean, they are not even riffs or melody, just rhythm, pure rhythm. Yeah, Meshuggah.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Christian Collins, welcome back to the channel, sir.
Thank you. So I guess I'm going to preface this. I guess I can relate to Reed here. I'm not a massive prog metal fan, really, by any stretch, but I really appreciate the elements that it brings to the table. I like to make the analogy of like chips and dip, right? To me, listening to just straight up progressive music is just like eating a bowl of dip without any chips. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It's too far removed from, to me, what the core tenets of metal are. And I feel the same way about like power metal, like European power metal, black metal. But I love those elements when bands can seamlessly infuse those elements. So I love like black and thrash. US power metal is great because it's a kind of a melting pot of a lot of different genres, what was going on at the time. And so I guess, obviously we're talking about the creativity and diversity of metal. So to me, it's perfect to kind of hit on, what was going on in the 80s and, bands that were taking in a lot of different ideas and, where I appreciate bands that infuse these progressive elements without kind of going too far on the spectrum, which I don't always love. So the first band I'm going to talk about is Queensryche. We've already mentioned this, Martin already mentioned Queensryche a few times. But when you look at Queensryche through a progressive metal lens, they're credited as one of the first progressive metal bands, but they in today's definition of progressive metal, you may not even categorize them within that genre. And even within the discography of Queensryche, you'd probably talk about like Rage for Order, Promised Land. A lot of people talk about Operation Mindcrime. To me, my favorite Queensryche album is their debut, The Warning. And it came out in 1984. So this is a time where metal was rapidly evolving towards, it had a trajectory, straight towards thrash, death, and black metal. And I think Queensryche, along with a lot of other US power metal bands, were going in different directions. And so, you could talk about, Manila Road, Cirith Ungol, Fate's Warning, obviously, even Merciful Fate was doing a lot of different things at the time. But to me, The Warning is such a monument in the metal genre because it brings, more sophistication to the genre. But it retains, great songwriting, musicianship, and it's still really anthemic, which is one of my favorite things about metal. Lyrically, it's more or less a concept album. It's not like Mindcrime where there's a set storyline that you're following, but, you have these themes of dystopia and sci-fi, sociology, lots of little metaphors to follow. And there's like clear intent and substance behind the lyrics, which is nice. But there's also like a lot of straightforward heavy metal to go around, which is what I like about it. So I want to highlight that album because any chance I get to talk about that album, I'll make an excuse to. I also want to talk about a similar band, Queensryche's younger brother, almost. Basically, Queensryche, if they came to the scene a couple years later, and instead of being really into Orwell, they were reading Tolkien instead. So the band is Crimson Glory, and the album is Crimson Glory. I'm going to talk about their debut. Another band that people talk about a lot, I would say they're a bit less progressive than Queensryche, a bit more power metal-y. But I'm not going to rehash everything that was going on at the time, but this album is incredible to me. The vocals, obviously Midnight is an amazing vocalist, took a lot after Jeff Tate. And to me, he's the greatest vocalist in metal, period. But they played with some keyboards and synthesizers. There's some unconventional riffing in there, and also a lot of atmosphere, which we talked about. Is these bands really like to create an atmosphere, and you don't kind of see that a lot, in the new wave of British heavy metal and what was going on in the early '80s, which is what I like about this kind of area. And then I also want to talk about a few years later, if you look to the thrash metal scene. So you have the first kind of wave of thrash with, the San Francisco bands and whatnot, what was going on in Germany. And all of that was kind of similar, is very standard and basic. But then you have this kind of second wave of bands in the late '80s and early '90s that were doing, I guess, what you would call tech thrash now. And a lot of it is just more sophisticated early thrash. So you have obviously more complex melodies and technical riffing, but you also have some more bands that leaned harder into the prog elements. So first band I want to talk about is on my shirt here. It's Coroner. So this is a band that, like I said, leaned more into those progressive tendencies. They kind of began and ended with this scene, and their first album was in '87, their last was in '93, and then they kind of died off, which is unfortunate, but great band. A lot of neoclassical shredding. Is My favorite album is probably Mental Vortex, but this one's a bit slower than their previous releases, but they like I said, they create a lot of atmosphere, some dissonant riffing. The production is very raw, but it's still very aggressive. So yeah, this scene is really interesting because I think it brings a lot more to the table. It shows that, this evolution of metal doesn't have to be so linear. We can throw in some different things, a lot of different influences. But like I said, I'm not here to say what progressive metal is and isn't. I'm not an expert on the genre, but I want to show my appreciation for kind of some of the bands that were infusing those elements in some cool places. So, yeah.
Sweet.
Good stuff.
Nice.
Yeah, when you were talking about the next Queensryche, I thought you were going Fate's Warning, but nice to hear Crimson Glory called out. Haven't thought about them in a long time.
Yeah, I don't know if I would call them a hidden gem because they do get talked about here and there, but to me, not enough. I mean, that first album is easily top 5 favorite albums of all time.
Yeah. All right. And bold choice picking The Warning as your favorite Queensryche album. That's going to cause some controversy. All right. So you know what? That's what it's all about, man. We're the Contrarians. Fight for your favorite album. I dig it. All right, let's move on to Phil. Phil, let's I want to open a bit with this idea of regionalism. So, heavy metal and progressive rock, both European phenomenon, but progressive metal, a North American phenomenon, I would say. You have arguably Rush, the first, possibly, proto at least, progressive metal band. Queensryche, definitely heavy metal and a progressive metal band. And again, Fate's Warning, Crimson Glory, these are all North American bands, but Europe embraced progressive metal, I think, in a way that North America never did, and kind of in parallel along with power metal. And those scenes kind of went at the same time, and they've always been a very small thing in American metal fandom, and I think in a much larger way in Europe. And I wonder if there's an explanation for that. Not to put you on the spot for all of Europe, but you're the only European on the show, so.
Yeah, no, you're right. Gee whiz. I don't really know how these things happen, It's the same thing like in almost all the arts, Like if you look at cinema, I'm a cinema guy. If you look at how cinema evolved from like the post-war era to today, a lot of it is based on this kind of circulation of certain trends and innovations that often start in Europe, which is considered very often as the center of the Western world or the center of Western civilization, all that. And it kind of circulates towards other countries, sometimes towards the US, sometimes towards even like Asia. And suddenly you get like American filmmakers like Martin Scorsese who do like films like European filmmakers were doing, a few years ago. So I don't know, there must be a certain pattern to how music and all the art forms sort of and culture in general travel and circulate from certain parts of the world to others and how the markets function. But it is an interesting phenomenon. Like where I come from, I've mentioned before, I'm from Greece originally, although I live in France. And in the late 90s, there were two bands that have been generally classified as progressive metal. They do maybe come from a more US power metal background, like Crimson Glory or like Sanctuary, this more darker, complex power metal, contrary to your Euro power like Stratovarius or Halloween. One of them was actually the only one I have in mind here is these guys here, Shadow Gallery, with like this is their most seminal album, Tyranny. And I don't know why, but where I came from, these guys were huge. The press in Greece was raving over Shadow Gallery, and they obtained a really big fan base in Greece, but they never toured because of money, health issues, various problems. But in Greece, people were constantly calling for them to tour, but they were never so big. In the US, well, they were maybe generally big in Europe, but in certain countries, there's a big fan base for certain bands, while in their homelands, there isn't. I don't know, I'm rambling a bit here, but I'm just sort of riffing on what you just asked. It's the same thing with like, this is not progressive metal, but with the band Rival Sons. They became huge in Europe, especially in England, in Belgium, and they're still very big there, and they've been getting bigger in the US now. But initially, for their very first albums, no one could care less about them in the United States. But in Europe, they were huge, but they come from the States. I don't know these trajectories, how they work exactly.
Yeah, Shadow Gallery, I was aware of them. They were not huge by any means in the States, but there was some awareness about them. So
I discovered them in 1998 because the local music metal rock press was just raving about them. I was like, well, we didn't have streaming back then, so I had to go to the record store, and I was like, this is amazing. So I got their discography, but they still are very much a marginal band. Obviously, they don't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. Anyway, drawing from what was discussed earlier, I want to go back to what Martin said and to sort of pinpoint to this to an important issue here, which is what you so eloquently said, which is the smushing of genres and styles and everything. And that's where you get progressive music. That's where you get creativity, people who are pushing boundaries, who are opening new pathways, a lot of expressive pathways, a lot of innovation. And very often it's not easy to exactly classify that, which brings me to the other issue of what is prog, right? Or what is prog metal? And that's really a contentious question. It's a very slippery slope. You don't want to go down there because then you will possibly you will look like an elitist. You will sound like an elitist who has this ivory tower of prog rock, prog metal. And he's like, no, that's not. But I think it is interesting to maybe just draw a distinction between what is really progressive and creative and what is maybe prog metal. And I always go back to Images and Words with Dream Theater, because there you have the case of a drummer, Mike Portnoy, who was with these guys who were listening to Queensryche and then basically just listening to their own favorite musicians like Al Di Meola, the Dixie Dregs, Marillion, etc. And he's bringing them Metallica. So they write this song called Pull Me Under, which is all atmosphere, melody, solos, a bit of a riff, that opening riff, down, down, down. But it's all very lush, very 80s sounding, very Marillion, Pink Floyd, emotional, spacey. And then we get those chugging guitars by John Petrucci, which was a result of him listening to Master of Puppets and to a lot of Metallica and bringing in these very Teutonic, monolithic, distorted guitar riffs, and that's like, bam, there we go, you know? If not the birth, then definitely a major chapter in what we call prog metal. And he was already influenced greatly by Alex Lifeson. He's been using a lot the trademark Alex Lifeson chords on the guitar, these open chords that he uses. And then he suddenly brings Metallica into the equation. And then later with Awake, he brought in a Dimebag Darrell, who was not a prog metal artist, but he was an immense innovator on the guitar and songwriting, everything. So, you know, prog metal is like this magpie genre. You know, they pick up on things like Pantera or Meshuggah, right? And then they bring into it 8-string guitars, and then suddenly you get a band, for example, like today from Norway, with I don't know if you should see here, with Leprous, for example, who don't sound at all like Dream Theater or Queensryche or any of the dinosaurs of prog metal. There's no denying that they have a prog streak in them. They incorporate a lot of pop, a lot of funk, and a lot of the other sort of trademark elements. And at the same time, they play with 8-string guitars, you know? And then suddenly you get John Petrucci, and he's on his latest album. He's like, okay, I'm going to try this 8-string guitar thing as well. So there's a lot of room for creativity and a lot of room for being progressive. But what is prog metal? I don't know. I would never call Meshuggah a prog metal band, although they've made their way into the prog metal press a lot and fandom, but I would never call them prog metal without wanting to be, you know, ivory tower about this. And then you get a band like Opeth, obviously, who are undeniably prog. And why is that so? Because Michael Ackerfeld got in touch with Steven Wilson, and the rest is history. And we mentioned Europe, Reed, and Europe has, let's say, one of its flagships for me is, or maybe was, because they're not so active anymore, is from Sweden with Pain of Salvation, who sound like nothing that came before, nothing to do with Dream Theater or Queensryche or Fate's Warning or the sort of US power metal scene. And again, they're undeniably prog, and they have a very much of metal sensibility. And okay, then you also get a band like, in the terms of diversity and creativity, you get a band like Mastodon, who, you know, on their album Leviathan, which is not exactly prog, they do have a 13-minute song which has a passage that is taken straight from something like Biter and the Snow Dog or something like that, you know, from Rush. But then they incorporate a lot of influence from King Crimson with a more metal sound. And suddenly everyone's like, okay, they're classified as prog. That's it. Mastodon are a prog metal band. And then finally, to finish, because I also listened recently to the last episode of Martin's podcast, which was on the idea of genius, whatever that can necessarily mean for everyone. You mentioned, I was very happy to hear that you mentioned, sort of in your honorable mentions, you had Devin Townsend, who, you know, I mean, his brain is a nuclear power plant, you know.
He's not from this planet, I don't think.
No, definitely not. You never know with what he might come up with, you know. I mean, he's very unpredictable, very, very unpredictable. And I don't know if he's prog metal in all of his projects, everything he's done. I don't know if exactly he's prog metal or not. He is classified alongside all the other big bands and artists of prog metal, maybe even prog rock to some extent. But when I heard Empath, I thought to myself, wait a second, this guy has disco with brutal death metal, and then he has a song that sounds like it came from the soundtrack of Frozen. You know, really, that's the case. Mm-hmm. But when initially you would think, okay, this guy is some kind of deranged genius who is just selling his madness to everyone, and it makes no sense, it's incoherent. No. When you listen to this from beginning to end, a number of times, it just reveals itself as this incredibly coherent and cohesive vision of music that is unclassifiable, very progressive, very creative. And it's the same reaction I had to the latest album by Avenged Sevenfold, of which I've never been a fan. They're an amazing band, amazing musicians, but they've never been my thing. And I listened to their latest album, and I thought, this is the most recent, most contemporary rendition of Queen's Night at the Opera. It's got every single genre imaginable, from thrash metal to Daft Punk to Frank Sinatra, Christmas music, and somehow it all makes sense. It all comes across as a coherent, cohesive vision, idea, a conceptual piece on music itself. And it's undeniably prog metal. And everyone was saying that this album would actually be unappealing to the base of Avenged Sevenfold, but it would probably capture the attention of prog fans. And it definitely captured my attention. So I really like that idea of like bands, either they come from prog or not, who can just blend shmush, as Martin said, all these genres and just make something that's totally new, but like logical, cohesive, coherent, and not just incomprehensive, I think that's all I had to say. Oh, and on Black Sabbath, I did want to say that obviously not prog metal, but there has been a debate that is still ongoing about Black Sabbath as a jazz band, especially because of Bill Ward's drumming, having apparently a lot of it coming from a sort of jazz background. Many people, I've heard very many people say that they're actually in some way a jazz band.
Yeah,
Right.
Very cool.
All
Hey,
right,
I just
very
wanted to just mention a couple of band names in the history just that haven't been mentioned along the way. This kind of goes off a little bit from what Christian said to start with. So late 80s, you've got the likes of Mekong Delta, Watchtower, Cynic. So you got that whole Texas thing going on as well. Not Mekong Delta. Voivod we haven't mentioned. They're massive prog metal. Big part of it starting in around, I think it's 84, but moving forward, like very extreme to begin with, and then proggier as time goes on, and then leaving it as well. So I think with a lot of, you can draw the parallel between all these artists, like even Picasso. I was watching a Picasso thing the other day, and who was the other one? Almost everybody has this pattern where they start figurative and more based in realism, and you move over time to more abstract art where you don't need the ego of showing how much craft you have anymore. And that's what happens with a lot of these bands. Marillion's kind of the same thing. But yeah, early on, I'm drinking out of my Queen cup. So basically Queen is kind of a progressive metal band, certainly on Queen 1, 2, Sheer Heart Attack. I would say Bohemian Rhapsody. You could call that a prog metal song. We've got the neo prog of the new wave of British heavy metal and the new wave of British prog with Marillion leading it. IQ, Saracen, Palace, all that. You've got Saga, which is like the baby lighter on their feet version of Rush kind of thing, right? You got Max Webster along the way. Odds and Sods ones in the middle. Last Crack I really like a lot. And then a couple of big ones, again, that lead to where we are now with this incredible, progressiveness of the more extreme end of things. You've got Gojira and then Enslaved, who's been on a complete different path, right? Yep. Enslaved and Gojira are not nowhere near the same path. But you might argue that maybe they started a little closer together than they are now, kind of thing. But so I guess in general, you put all this in a big blender, and I think what we're saying here is that metal is in a very, very, very progressive place right now. So I think progressive metal is a very vital thing, and I guess we would also say that given the state of highly, highly technical deathcore, it's lining up with that idea of where young people's minds are being rewired to just think of this as heavy metal. And we all look at it as old people and go, I can't believe you're not noticing how absolutely manic and difficult and double bass and everything that this is, how complicated, how hard it would be for these guys to memorize this stuff, right? But young people just go, that's metal. But it's way more progressive than any progressive metal we ever listened to.
Right.
But what's interesting about that is that a lot of the younger audience today, let's say teenagers into early 20s, they're listening a lot to bands like Periphery and Tesseract, who come from a semi-metalcore gent background, and they've very much morphed into something very progressive. But they also hark back to the sort of emo scene with bands like Bring Me the Horizon, who were always very, very, very appealing to a young audience who would also listen to My Chemical Romance and to Blink 182 or whatever, and somehow they kept following these bands who kept growing. And some of these bands also have musicians of the YouTube age who have been studying guitar endlessly by watching all these videos and learning very fast and perfecting their craft. And suddenly you get a band like Tesseract or Periphery who have more of this kind of emotional, let's say, background, and they've morphed into something far more technical, demanding, but somehow they've broken into the mainstream. And you have these bands who are now have a bigger fan base than Dream Theater ever had or ever will have.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Very cool.
One of the things that I think is really interesting about what's going on right now in pop culture and people's perceptions of what's going on in the music industry, you hear so many people say, "Oh, there's no good music anymore. Oh, we've got to keep listening to Dark Side of the Moon and Rumors all over and over again because there's no good music anymore." And I'm like, I say to those people, and I say this to people my age sometimes, and they sort of look at me like I'm from another planet, but I say, you've got to go darker. You've got to go towards what you might think of as metal, because that's where all the people that should be superstars. Devin Townsend, I'm not even that big of a fan of him, but he should be a superstar. I mean, he probably really does fit the definition of genius. But that's where everything's happening, and it's I mean, you could also say accurately that there's lots of new melodic rock that isn't progressive that is out there. But if people go the same path, if they think they're going to hear stuff on the radio, that's not what it's going to take. It's going to take opening your horizons to heavier genres, because I think that's where the best things are happening.
Nice.
All right. So I think what we've looked at is a bit of an evolution. If you go all the way back to the 70s, progressive was, in its most basic form, a radio format, where you're talking about radio DJs who would play longer songs instead of the 3-minute 45 RPM record. And the longer format song allowed bands to incorporate jazz elements and different time signatures, and this music became known as progressive music. By the time we get to the 1980s, and hopefully Martin will back me up on this, but in the 1980s, we called any heavy metal band that put out a concept album that was progressive, right? Mm-hmm. So when Iron Maiden put out Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, that was Iron Maiden's progressive album.
Yeah.
Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah. That's a whole nother show. We should all get together and do a concept album show, right?
Absolutely. I'm up for that. But now progressive means moving forward. No, I'm not even going to go there. It means moving forward. So progressive metal, moving forward into the future. We've talked about a lot of ways in which metal is moving forward. And at the same time, it's moving back. I was watching a documentary on English doom bands, which are actually moving forward by simplifying, increasing the volume, down-tuning their guitars, and going back to Black Sabbath. So it's all one big whirlpool of music, and it's just a fantastic time to be a music fan. If you listen to new music, old music, it's all fantastic. And it's been a great panel. Thank you, guys. I've had a good education. I think it's been a fun chat. Thank you for coming on and educating me about progressive metal. I hope everybody else has had a good time. Want to call out the Patreon. We do have a Patreon situation for the Contrarians. We do fun stuff. Marco has been doing these AI-generated art album covers just for fun. He puts up these AI-generated
not really covers. AI. We just basically come up with an idea, and it's more like photoshopping, cut and pasting with a little bit of AI. Yeah.
No, I'm talking about just on Patreon. He's been doing
those,
AI generated.
Those are a blast, yeah.
And I loved this one so much. I said, "Hey, dude, this is Black Sabbath does the Wizard of Oz."
Oh, wicked, yeah.
And I loved it so much. I was like, "Slap that on a T-shirt for me, buddy," and he did.
Yeah.
So we do all kinds of fun stuff on the Patreon. Come and join us. It's a great community. And maybe join us on a chat sometime. And until then, this has been the Contrarians. We'll see you on another chat. Thanks, everyone.